Shabbat Shalom. Let's learn this week's Torah portion with Rashi's commentary. Parshat Shlach Lecha, chapter 13, verse 2 is the opening verse of the parsha. And sometimes people just refer to it as Parshat Shlach, and sometimes as Parshat Shlach Lecha. I would argue the latter is the better name of the parsha because of the very particular emphasis placed on personal decision making within the Torah and within Jewish tradition. The word lacha in this case comes not just to say, yes, I'm speaking to you, Moses. It's not just God commanding, you're going to send scouts or spies to the land of Israel because the Israelites asked you. It's you have a big decision to make, Moses. And for every generation after you, they should understand that I really do give you free will. I really do give you a choice to embrace my commandments. And you will live with the consequences of either saying yes and embracing them or somehow completely losing faith in what God has promised and what God has commanded. You could even read so far as to say that God didn't even really do this commandment, but that the Israelites requested something and was repeating back to Moses what the Holy One heard when Moses came to talk with God in a moment of prayer and tell God during tefillah, this is what the Israelites want from me. This is what they want me to do. They want me to send scouts, spies, to see if we can accomplish this task of inheriting the land of Israel. Should I send them, God? Should I really send them? And this kind of dialogue that's presented as part of a prayerful encounter with the divine can inform prayer life as well. And that can expand the traditional Talmudic notion that prayer, tefillah, is based on a three-part kind of reality of shevach, of praise, of bakasha, of making requests, and hodaya, of thanks and gratitude. It expands it to have a fourth element, at least using that framework, and that is the element of hachlata, that prayer is a filter of sorts for decision making, a decision tree of sorts, and that our inner talk with the most divine element within our hearts, turning to God who is transcendent, that there can be a real moment of clarification within prayer about decisions we need to make. And those decisions, of course, bear consequences, and we will have to live with them. This episode in Parshat Shlach Lecha, the entire narrative, is really much about that. But here's how Rashi amplifies both this notion of making our own choices at critical moments in life and about living with their consequences, in addition to taking those decisions that we have to make into our prayer life with us so that we can gain further clarity about what exactly we want to decide. The verse itself says, Shlach lecha anashim, vayaturu et eretz Canaan asher ani noten livnei Yisrael, ish echad ish echad l'matei avotav tishlachu kol nasivehem. So God says to Moses, reading it in terms of the greater narrative that's created, if we read with Rashi. I heard you say that the Israelites have asked you to send spies to go into the land of Israel that I'm giving them as an inheritance. One leader from every one of the ancestral tribes, find the chieftain among them and send them forward. The idea, though, Rashi says, is that Shlach Lecha, God said Shlach Lecha because God was explaining that it's really your choice, Moses. L'da'atcha. This is something you have to make up your mind about. Ani, I, God, Eini mitzaveh lecha. I'm not commanding you at this moment. It would be very easy right? If God said, this is exactly what you need to do at this point, then no choice. I know, I get up in the morning. God says, through the understanding we have of the commandment, put on your tefillin. Sometimes I may or may not feel like putting on my tefillin in the morning, but I know that's a commandment, and therefore there's no question. But here, Moses is given that power to make a decision all his own about how the story of inheriting the land of Israel will unfold and how it will impact those individual people of the first generation in the wilderness and generations afterwards. God says, Im tirtzeh shlach. This is a matter of your free will choice. You'll clarify. If you want to send them, send them. Lefi sheba'u Yisrael v'amru, and this is where Rashi then says, and we know this is how the conversation went down because it was, as we learn in Deuteronomy, Rashi will sometimes learn from places in the Torah that quote unquote come afterwards. But this is Moses reporting about what happened at this time of the first generation's request in Deuteronomy. What did they say? Nishlacha anashim lefanenu. We should send men ahead of us to scout out the land. And God had said to them that the land was good, but they somehow lacked a little faith and that they could really inherit the land. They lacked the confidence. They said, we need to send spies and really figure out what's there. Moshe nimlach b'shechina. At that time, Moses really turned to the inner sense of the divine, the indwelling presence of God. And that I'm suggesting is the reality that tefillah, Moses' prayer life at that time, was about his deciding whether or not he was going to go ahead with this prayer that with this plan that the Israelite people had really suggested. Amar ani amarti lahem shehi tova. He thought in his mind, wait a minute, God really told us that the land was good and the land was ours, and that God, in bringing us there, was taking us out of the misery of Egypt. And there's an aliyah happening. There's this spiritual and physical going up to the land of Israel, unfolding. Chayehem. Shani noten lehem makom lit'ot b'divrei hameraglim l'ma'an lo yireshua. And here's what it says then. I swear by their lives that I give them room to err through the words of the spies, so that they shall not take possession of it. God wished to give the Israelites the option of sending the spies. And even sinning through them, even being seduced by their reports, undermined by their conclusions. Why? Maybe because they already showed a lack of faith and God helps continue us along the path that we choose for ourselves to begin with. Or maybe because it's the lesson that the first generation ultimately sacrificed everything for. That even with God's commandments, we have the total freedom of choice, and if we'll choose to have faith, even if there's some doubt in faith, even if there are some fissures and cracks in the foundation of our faith, and we have to live with those and ask deep questions about, we have the full-out choice, and we can either be like those spies who came back and reported a lack of confidence and being like grasshoppers in the eyes of the inhabitants of Canaan, or we could be like Joshua and Caleb, the two spies who really, bechevruta, who came together, found each other, in each other strength and a sense of purpose and a sense of commitment to fulfilling God's great promise for the Jewish people. Point being that the first generation sacrificed everything so that we would have total choice, free will, in order to embrace the very promises that God made to our ancestors and still to this day makes for us, the Jewish people. Vis-a-vis Moses' moment of decision making, it's a wonderful lesson for us about how to use our prayer space and time and life. Not just for praise and not just for request and not just for thanks and gratitude, which makes up a very, very big part of our prayer lives. We can bring major decisions into prayer space, into our prayer lives, into our tefillah. And when we get a sense that God has granted us, truly granted us enough free will, enough agency in our lives to make the hard choices and to realize that we ourselves will live with the consequences of those choices, then we feel the ultimate freedom. But making a choice sometimes, most of the time, making a choice is an exercising of freedom as opposed to just leaving all options open. And that exercise of free will to make a choice, to send or not to send in this case, to do a mitzvah or not to do a mitzvah, that is an exercise of freedom more than just coasting along on autopilot and accepting the kind of reality of our lives, like the autonomic nervous system that helps us breathe. That's not how to live. Live consciously, live constructing a life of holiness, live embracing the holy mission that we have and all the promises that God made. That is part and parcel of Shlach Lecha's message. The 10 spies who came back and created the crisis of confidence, or shared that they just couldn't fulfill God's promise on the human partner side. They stand as the first minyan that came together and deeply impacted one another with that kind of negativity and lack of faith. They were granted that choice. Moses made the decision to give that space for error, for erring. As they say, to err is human. But we are held accountable for our choices, ultimately good and bad. And so, may we more deeply clarify the decisions we have to make. May we, please God, choose the holy and all God hopes and what's best for us, our lives, our families, our communities, and Am Yisrael, now and into our futures. Shabbat Shalom.